"You're just the old Indian woman who needs to be managed," my daughter-in-law wrote to her railroad baron uncle about stealing my mining fortune. So I smiled and agreed to their deadly desert survey. They abandoned me and a stolen baby in the canyon to die, thinking they'd eliminated two inconvenient witnesses. But they never expected this powerless widow to survive using traditional Ute knowledge, expose their child trafficking network to federal marshals, or return from the dead with evidence that destroyed their entire criminal operation. When Thomas saw me alive in the town square holding the baby they'd left to die, he whispered, "That's impossible." I replied, "So is underestimating a grandmother with nothing left to lose." Now they're serving life sentences while I raised the child they tried to murder. Was I wrong to destroy my own son's life so completely Thomas tried to murder me? But he's still the boy I raised and loved for 30 years. Should blood family get a second chance even after betrayal this deep? Tell me, if your own child tried to kill you for money, could you forgive them, or would you choose justice over motherhood like I did? I am Mary, a 62-year-old Ute Scottish mining heiress who used my son's betrayal to expose a territorial murder and theft network spanning 3 states. Let me take you back to that crisp October morning in 1893, when I still believed family meant something more than mining claims and silver dollars. My name is Mary Whitehorse Harrison, and at 62 I'd seen enough of Colorado territory to know the difference between fool's gold and the real thing. What I hadn't learned yet was how to tell the difference between family and predators. The morning sun was just cresting over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains when I heard horses approaching my mining office in Silverdale. Through the frosted window, I could see my son Thomas riding up with his wife Victoria, their breath visible in the cold mountain air. Thomas sat his horse like the Eastern college boy he'd always been, even after 10 years in Colorado. Victoria rode with the confidence of the Texas cattle rancher's daughter she was, controlling, calculating, always assessing the value of everything around her. "Morning, Mother," Thomas called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness I'd been hearing more often since his father Robert died 2 years ago. "We brought fresh coffee from Mrs. Vasquez's place." I stepped onto the wooden porch, pulling my wool shawl tighter against the mountain chill. The mining office Robert had built was solid timber and stone designed to withstand Colorado winters and occasional claim jumpers. Behind me, the walls displayed survey maps, mining certificates, and the eagle feather my Ute grandfather had given me at 16, a reminder of the heritage that taught me to read both land and people. "Coffee's always welcome," I said, accepting the warm tin cup Victoria handed me. "Though I suspect you didn't ride out here just to share breakfast." Victoria's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Actually, we have something that could make us all very wealthy. Thomas has discovered something extraordinary." I studied my daughter-in-law's face, noting how her gray eyes glittered with unusual intensity. In my grandfather's tradition, I'd learned to watch for signs people give when their words hide dangerous intentions. Victoria had been displaying those signs frequently since Robert's funeral, especially when conversations turned to my mining fortune. "What kind of discovery?" I asked, sipping the coffee and tasting something bitter beneath the familiar warmth. Thomas pulled out a folded map, spreading it across the porch railing with trembling hands. "There's a canyon system 20 miles southeast. The geological formations suggest the largest silver deposits we've ever seen, possibly gold. We've studied the area for weeks, and Mother, this could triple our family fortune." The map showed terrain I knew intimately, remote desert canyons bordering Ute tribal lands and Mexican land grants. This was isolated territory where mining claims disappeared into territorial court disputes, where people vanished without anyone knowing where to look. "This is sensitive land, Thomas," I said carefully. "Your grandfather Whitehorse took me there for vision quests when I was young. The Ute consider parts of that canyon system sacred, and it's days from any settlement. Which is exactly why we need someone with your connections to help secure claims before anyone else discovers what we've found," Victoria said, her tone suggesting she viewed my Ute heritage as the key to unlocking millions in silver. I felt the familiar chill that came whenever Victoria reduced my cultural identity to something exploitable for profit. My mother had been full-blood Ute, my father a Scottish mining engineer who'd respected both the land and its original inhabitants. I'd grown up walking between two worlds, learning to honor the mining knowledge that built our fortune and the cultural wisdom that taught me to read truth in people's hearts. Something in Thomas's desperation made me examine the map more closely. The canyon he'd marked was more than remote. It was treacherous, accessible only by narrow trails winding through desert wasteland where a person could die of exposure in hours. It was the kind of place where accidents happened, where bodies might never be found. When I looked up, Victoria was watching me with the focused intensity of a hawk studying prey. Her mask had slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath her smile. "We'll pick you up at dawn," she said with finality. "Dress for desert travel. We'll be riding hard and fast." Watching them ride away, I noticed Victoria studying what looked like official papers, with the satisfaction of someone whose plans were falling perfectly into place. She was calculating something far more dangerous than silver deposits, and I had the growing certainty that tomorrow's ride into that remote canyon might be a journey I wasn't meant to survive. Dawn came cold and sharp across the Colorado mountains, and I was waiting on my porch when Thomas and Victoria rode up leading a third horse. The pack animals carried mining equipment. Picks, shovels, sample bags, but something about the setup felt wrong. Too much gear for a simple survey, not enough for serious mining work. "Ready for our adventure, Mother," Victoria called out, her cheerfulness sounding forced in the crisp morning air. She was dressed for hard riding in leather chaps and a wide-brimmed hat, but I noticed she carried no surveying instruments, no geological tools that would be essential for the kind of assessment they'd described. I mounted my mare Sage, a steady mountain horse who'd carried me through Colorado wilderness for 8 years. As we rode southeast toward the desert canyons, Thomas kept glancing nervously at Victoria like a schoolboy waiting for permission to speak. The silence between them felt heavy with secrets. The terrain changed gradually as we left the mining district behind. Pine forests gave way to scrub oak, then to desert sage and red rock formations that rose like ancient monuments from the Colorado Plateau. This was the borderland between worlds. Anglo mining claims to the North Ute tribal territory to the south, and Mexican land grants scattered throughout like pieces of a puzzle that territorial courts were still trying to solve. "The canyon's just ahead," Thomas said as we crested a ridge. Below us stretched a maze of red rock canyons, their walls carved by centuries of flash floods and wind. It was beautiful, desolate country where a person could ride for days without seeing another soul. We descended into the canyon system along a narrow trail that wound between towering sandstone walls. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of our horses' hooves on stone and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. This was sacred country to my grandfather's people, a place where young Ute warriors came to seek visions and commune with the spirits of the land. "Here," Victoria announced suddenly, reining in her horse beside a small side canyon. "This is where the geological surveys indicated the richest deposits." I looked around at the barren rock walls, seeing nothing that suggested mineral wealth. In 40 years of mining, I'd learned to read the signs that indicated precious metal deposits, certain rock colorations, quartz veins, specific geological formations. This canyon showed none of those indicators. "Victoria," I said carefully, "I don't see any evidence of silver or gold deposits here. The rock formations are all wrong, and there's no water source to support mining operations." That's when her mask finally fell away completely. She turned to face me with a smile that was pure predator. "You're absolutely right, Mother Harrison. There's no silver here, no gold either. But there is something very valuable. Your signature on some documents that will solve all our financial problems." Thomas dismounted and pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebags, his hands shaking as he opened it. "Mom, we need you to sign these papers. They're for your own protection." I stayed mounted on Sage, every instinct my grandfather had taught me screaming danger. The papers Thomas held were legal documents. I could see official seals and territorial court stamps from where I sat. "What kind of protection?" "The kind that recognizes you're no longer capable of managing your mining fortune," Victoria said, dismounting and moving to block the canyon entrance behind us. "You've been showing signs of mental decline, Mother Harrison. Confusion, memory loss, poor judgment. These documents transfer your assets to Thomas and me for safekeeping." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. My own son, the boy I'd raised, educated, loved unconditionally, was trying to steal everything Robert and I had built together. Thomas, you can't be serious about this. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. Victoria says it's the only way. The mining business is more complicated now, and you're getting older. We're just trying to protect the family fortune. By stealing it, I dismounted slowly, keeping Sage between myself and Victoria. And what happens if I refuse to sign? Victoria's smile turned cruel. Well, elderly widow, recent health concerns got disoriented in the desert during a family outing. These canyons are dangerous. Flash floods, rock slides, easy to have a tragic accident. That's when I heard it. A sound that made my blood freeze. A baby crying, the thin wail of an infant echoing off the canyon walls. The sound was coming from a hidden alcove in the rock face where someone had made a rough camp. Whose baby is that? I demanded, moving toward the sound. Stay back! Victoria snapped, but I was already pushing past her toward the alcove. What I found there broke my heart and filled me with rage. A tiny infant, maybe 2 or 3 months old, lying on a blanket in the shade of the rocks. The child was clean and fed, but obviously not cared for by people who loved him. His dark hair and bronze skin suggested mixed heritage, possibly Ute and Mexican, the kind of child who'd be invisible to territorial authorities if he disappeared. Where did this baby come from? I asked, lifting the infant carefully. He was beautiful, with serious dark eyes that seemed far too old for his tiny face. Thomas and Victoria exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know. They'd brought this child here deliberately, as part of whatever scheme they were planning. His mother won't be needing him anymore, Victoria said coldly. And neither will you unless you sign those papers right now. I held the baby closer, feeling his small body relax against my chest. Whatever evil plan they'd hatched, this innocent child was part of it, and I was the only thing standing between him and whatever fate they had planned. Go to hell, I said, backing toward where the horses were tied. Victoria moved faster than I expected, grabbing Sage's reins and leading my horse away from reach. I was hoping you'd be reasonable, Mother Harrison, but if you insist on making this difficult. She nodded to Thomas, who reluctantly moved to block my escape route. They had me trapped in the canyon with a baby in my arms, miles from help with no horse and no way to signal for assistance. That's when Victoria pulled out a knife and cut through my saddlebags, scattering my supplies across the desert floor. Enjoy your time in the wilderness, she said. Don't worry about the baby. We'll take good care of him once you're gone. As they mounted their horses and rode away, leaving me stranded in the desert with an infant, I realized this wasn't just about stealing my fortune. It was about eliminating me permanently and using this child as part of some larger scheme I was only beginning to understand. The first rule of desert survival that my Ute grandfather taught me was simple: find shelter before the sun gets high, find water before it gets low. With a baby in my arms and the October sun already climbing toward its merciless peak, I had maybe 2 hours before the canyon walls became an oven that could kill us both. I gathered what supplies I could from where Victoria had scattered them: a wool blanket, a small water canteen that was barely quarter full, some jerky, and a tin cup. The baby watched me with those serious dark eyes, too young to understand our danger, but old enough to sense my urgency. He needed milk-clean water and warmth when the desert cold came with nightfall. Moving deeper into the side canyon, I found what I was looking for: a natural shelter carved into the sandstone by centuries of wind and water. The alcove was deep enough to provide shade and protection, with a small seep of water trickling from a crack in the rock face. It wasn't much, but it might keep us alive. I made a nest for the baby using my shawl and the blanket, positioning him where the rock would shield him from both sun and wind. The little water I had would have to be rationed carefully, a few drops at a time for the infant, small sips for myself. I'd seen people die of thirst in these canyons, their bodies mummified by the dry air and relentless sun. As I worked to create our small sanctuary, traditional knowledge my grandfather had taught me came flooding back. Which plants held moisture in their roots, how to read the signs of underground water, how to signal for help using smoke and reflected light. The white man's world had made me a wealthy mining widow, but it was my Ute heritage that would keep us alive. The baby began to fuss as the afternoon heat intensified. I dipped a corner of cloth in our precious water and let him suck the moisture, singing softly in the Ute language my mother had taught me. The ancient words seemed to calm him, and he settled into an uneasy sleep against my chest. That's when I heard voices echoing off the canyon walls. Thomas and Victoria had returned, but they weren't alone. I could hear at least 2 other riders with them, their voices carrying clearly in the still desert air. I pressed deeper into our shelter, holding the baby close and straining to listen. "The old woman won't last long out here," Victoria was saying. "Desert heat during the day, freezing cold at night, no horse-limited water. By the time anyone thinks to look for her, there won't be enough left to identify." "What about the baby?" This was a man's voice I didn't recognize, with a slight accent that suggested Mexican heritage. "He's served his purpose," Victoria replied coldly. "Once the territorial court processes the adoption papers, we'll have legal claim to the Harrison mining fortune through Thomas as the child's guardian. After that, well, babies die in the desert just as easily as old women." My blood turned to ice. They'd stolen this child, forged adoption papers, and planned to use him to legitimize their theft of my fortune. Once they had legal control of my assets, both the baby and I would become inconvenient witnesses to murder. "Judge Thornfield wants to know about the other cases," the unknown man continued. "The Vasquez woman in Santa Fe is asking questions about her missing granddaughter. Says the girl was pregnant when she disappeared." Thomas's voice was shaky when he answered. "Victoria says the judge can handle territorial inquiries. That's what we're paying him for." "Judge Thornfield has been very helpful," Victoria agreed. "Falsifying court records, expediting adoptions, making sure certain deaths don't get investigated too closely. But he's getting nervous about the scope of our operation." Operation. This wasn't just about my fortune. It was a systematic scheme targeting vulnerable people across the territory. Missing pregnant girls, stolen babies, murdered elderly victims, all coordinated through a corrupt territorial judge. As their voices grew fainter, moving away from our canyon, I looked down at the sleeping baby in my arms. Someone had loved this child enough to carry him for 9 months, only to have him stolen by these monsters. His mother might be the missing granddaughter they'd mentioned, another victim of their murderous greed. I studied his tiny features in the fading light, seeing the beautiful blend of cultures that made up his heritage. His skin was the warm bronze of desert sand, his hair black as a raven's wing. There were faint markings on his tiny wrist, not birthmarks, but what looked like traditional tattoos, the kind some Mexican families use to identify their children. Running my finger gently over the marks, I recognized the pattern. It was a design I'd seen before during trading visits to Mexican settlements south of Colorado Territory. This baby wasn't just stolen. He'd been taken from a family that had marked him as precious, as belonging to a specific lineage and community. As the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, I made a promise to the sleeping child in my arms. We would survive this desert. We would expose the monsters who'd stolen him from his family, and we would make sure he grew up knowing the truth about where he came from. The night would be cold and dangerous, but my grandfather's teachings would guide us through the darkness. And when morning came, we would begin the journey home, not just to safety, but to justice. I wrapped us both in the wool blanket as the temperature began to drop, feeling the baby's steady heartbeat against my chest. Whatever evil scheme Thomas and Victoria had planned, they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the strength that comes from having something more precious than your own life to protect. Dawn came slowly to the desert canyon, painting the sandstone walls in shades of rose and gold. I'd managed to keep the baby and myself alive through the freezing night, but we were both weak from thirst and exposure. The little water we had was nearly gone, and the infant needed milk I couldn't provide. That's when I heard it, the sound that meant salvation. A low whistle repeated 3 times, echoing off the canyon walls. It was the traditional Ute signal my grandfather had taught me, the call used by hunting parties to locate each other in difficult terrain. I answered with the proper response, a series of short whistles that identified me as Whitehorse Clan. Within minutes, I heard horses approaching along the canyon floor, moving with the careful precision of riders who knew this country like their own heartland. Joseph Whitehorse appeared at the mouth of our shelter, his weathered face breaking into relief when he saw us alive. My half-brother was 10 years younger than me, but looked older, his features carved by decades of leading his people through the difficult transition between the old ways and the new territorial realities. "Sister," he said in Ute, dismounting and approaching our shelter with the respect due to a sacred space where life had been preserved. "The spirits told me to ride this direction. I see they spoke truly." Behind him came 2 younger Ute men I recognized. His sons trained in both traditional tracking and the practical skills needed to survive in a world where their people had to navigate between tribal law and territorial courts. "Joseph," I whispered, my voice hoarse from thirst. "Thank the ancestors you found us." He knelt beside us, offering a water skin filled with clean, cold water. As I drank gratefully, he examined the baby with the careful attention of someone who understood that children were the future of any people. "This child is not of your blood," he observed, noting the Mexican family markings on the infant's wrist. "But you protect him as if he were your own grandson." "They stole him," I said, my voice growing stronger as the water revived me. "Thomas and Victoria, along with others. They're part of a criminal network that steals children, murders elderly people, and uses corrupt territorial courts to legitimize their crimes." Joseph's expression darkened. "We have been hearing stories from the Mexican settlements. Pregnant girls disappearing, babies taken from their families, grandmothers dying under suspicious circumstances. The territorial authorities claim they are investigating, but nothing changes." As his sons helped me to my feet and prepared a travois to carry us safely out of the canyon, I told Joseph everything I'd learned. The scope of the criminal operation, Judge Thornfield's involvement, the systematic targeting of vulnerable people across multiple communities. "This child bears the markings of the Herrera family from the Rio Grande settlements," Joseph said, studying the tattoos on the baby's wrist. "They are good people traders who have dealt fairly with our tribe for 3 generations. If this is their grandson, they have been searching for him and his mother for months." The pieces were falling into place. The missing granddaughter, Victoria's accomplice, had mentioned the baby with Mexican heritage markings, the systematic operation targeting multiple communities. It all pointed to a network that crossed cultural and territorial boundaries. "We need to get word to the Herrera family," I said as we began the careful journey out of the canyon system. "But more importantly, we need to stop this network before they kill more innocent people." Joseph nodded grimly. "The territorial courts will not listen to Ute testimony, and the Mexican families have no legal standing in Colorado territory, but there are other ways to seek justice." "What do you mean?" "There is a federal marshal who has been investigating territorial corruption. Agent Samuel Crawford sent by Washington to look into reports of judicial misconduct. He has been asking the right questions, but he needs evidence that will stand up in federal court." My heart leaped with hope. A federal marshal meant justice that couldn't be bought by territorial judges or intimidated by local corruption. "Can you get word to him? Better than that?" Joseph smiled for the first time since finding us. "He is currently staying at the Vasquez boarding house in Silverdale, investigating the disappearance of Elena Vasquez's granddaughter, the same girl whose baby you now hold in your arms." As we rode toward home, the baby sleeping peacefully in my arms, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. The strength that comes from having true family around you. Not the family you're born into, but the family that chooses to stand with you when evil threatens the innocent. "There's something else you should know," Joseph said as we crested the ridge that would take us back toward Silverdale. "Thomas and Victoria have been telling people you died in the desert. They filed papers with the territorial court claiming you suffered from mental confusion and wandered off during a family outing. The audacity of their lies filled me with cold rage. They'd tried to murder me, stolen an innocent child, and now they were using my supposed death to steal everything Robert and I had built together." "Let them think I'm dead," I said, looking down at the baby who represented so much more than just one stolen life. "It will give us the advantage we need to bring down their entire network." Joseph's smile was sharp as winter wind. "The dead make very dangerous enemies, sister, especially when they have the living to fight for." As Silverdale came into view in the distance, I realized that my resurrection would be more than just a return from the desert. It would be the beginning of justice for all the victims of this criminal network and the start of a new kind of family, one built on protection of the innocent rather than exploitation of the vulnerable. The hidden cave Joseph led us to was an ancient Ute sanctuary carved into the mountainside above Silverdale, where generations of tribal councils had met to make decisions that affected their people's survival. Now it would serve as the headquarters for our own fight for justice, a place where federal law and traditional wisdom could work together against territorial corruption. Sheriff Jake Morrison was waiting for us when we arrived along with Elena Vasquez, whose weathered face showed the strain of months spent searching for her missing granddaughter. When Elena saw the baby in my arms, she gasped and crossed herself. Dios mío, she whispered, reaching out to touch the infant's tiny hand. Those are Herrera family markings. This is little Miguel, my daughter Rosa's son. We have been searching for them both since they disappeared from Santa Fe 6 months ago. The pieces of the criminal network were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Rosa Vasquez Herrera, pregnant and vulnerable, had been targeted by the same operation that had tried to eliminate me. They'd taken her baby and, judging by Elena's tears, probably killed her in the process. There are more cases, Sheriff Morrison said grimly, spreading out a collection of reports and testimonies on a blanket. I've been quietly investigating suspicious deaths and disappearances across 3 territories. What I've found suggests a systematic operation targeting elderly people with substantial assets and young women from vulnerable communities. I studied the documents by lamplight, my mining experience helping me recognize the patterns that connected seemingly unrelated incidents. They're not random crimes, I realized. This is a business operation with specific target demographics and standardized methods. Joseph nodded. The Ute have heard stories from trading partners across the region. Wealthy widows dying in accidents shortly after showing signs of mental confusion, pregnant girls from poor families disappearing without trace, babies appearing in territorial courts with falsified adoption papers. Elena wiped her eyes and spoke with the controlled fury of a grandmother whose family had been destroyed. Judge Thornfield processed the adoption papers for little Miguel, said Rosa had died in childbirth and requested the baby be placed with a wealthy Anglo family for his own good. We tried to contest it, but Mexican families have no legal standing in territorial court. That's where the federal marshal comes in, Sheriff Morrison explained. Agent Samuel Crawford has jurisdiction over territorial judicial corruption. He's been building a case against Judge Thornfield for months, but he needs witnesses who can testify about the scope of the operation. The scope was staggering. As we compiled evidence through the night, a picture emerged of a criminal network that stretched across Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona territories. Judge Thornfield provided legal cover through falsified court documents. Thomas and Victoria handled the actual murders and kidnappings. Unknown accomplices scouted for targets and managed the financial aspects of stealing inheritances. How many people have they killed? I asked, looking at the growing pile of suspicious death reports. At least 12 elderly victims that we can document, Morrison replied. And probably 6 or 7 young mothers whose babies were stolen and sold through illegal adoption schemes. Elena's voice was steady despite her tears. Rosa was so excited about her baby. She had chosen the name Miguel after her grandfather planned to raise him with love and respect for both his Mexican and Anglo heritage. These monsters turned her joy into their profit. I looked down at baby Miguel sleeping peacefully in my arms, thinking about his mother's dreams and the evil that had destroyed them. Agent Crawford needs to understand this isn't just about territorial corruption. It's about systematic genocide targeting specific communities. Joseph spoke up. The Ute Tribal Council has voted to provide testimony to federal authorities. We have documented cases of our young women disappearing, of elderly tribal members dying under suspicious circumstances after showing sudden mental confusion. The Mexican settlements are ready to testify as well, Elena added. We've been keeping our own records, our own investigations. Federal law is our only hope for justice. Sheriff Morrison gathered up the documents. I'll arrange a meeting with Agent Crawford tomorrow. But we need to be careful. If Judge Thornfield realizes we're building a federal case against him, he'll try to eliminate witnesses. Let him try, I said, feeling the cold determination that had kept me alive in the desert. I'm supposed to be dead already. That gives us an advantage they don't expect. As we prepared to leave the cave sanctuary, Joseph placed a hand on my shoulder. Sister, you understand that once we contact the federal authorities, there will be no going back. Thomas is your blood son, but he has chosen to stand with murderers. I looked at baby Miguel, thinking about his mother Rosa, who had died to give him life, about the other victims, whose only crime was being vulnerable in a world where predators wore the masks of family and legal authority. Thomas stopped being my son the moment he tried to murder me for money, I said. This baby has more claim to my protection than the man who tried to kill me. Elena smiled through her tears. Rosa would be proud to know her son is being protected by such a fierce grandmother. As dawn approached over the Colorado mountains, I realized that my resurrection from the desert would mean more than just personal survival. It would be the beginning of justice for all the victims of this criminal network and the creation of a new kind of family, one built on protection of the innocent rather than exploitation of the vulnerable. The federal marshal would get his evidence, Judge Thornfield would face justice, and baby Miguel would grow up knowing the truth about his brave mother and the community that fought to save him. Elena Vasquez's boarding house had become the unofficial headquarters for our investigation, its thick adobe walls providing privacy for the dangerous work of gathering evidence against Judge Thornfield's criminal network. As the sun set over Silverdale, witnesses arrived quietly through the back entrance, each carrying pieces of a puzzle that revealed the true scope of territorial corruption. Maria Santos, a seamstress from the Mexican quarter, spoke first. My sister Carmen disappeared 8 months ago. She was with child due to deliver in the spring. Judge Thornfield told us she died of fever, but the midwife said she was healthy when they took her to his private clinic. Her testimony matched the pattern we'd documented. Pregnant women from vulnerable communities disappearing into Thornfield's network, their babies sold through falsified adoption papers while the mothers were eliminated. Old Pete McCarthy, a prospector who'd worked claims near the territorial courthouse, provided financial evidence. I seen the judge's books when I was fixing his office stove. Payments coming in from mining families, cattle ranchers, folks with money. Always the same amount, exactly 10% of whatever inheritance got processed through his court. The financial corruption was systematic. Thornfield took a percentage of every stolen fortune, creating a business model based on murdering elderly victims and stealing their assets through legal manipulation. Dr. Samuel Brennan, the only honest physician in 3 counties, arrived after dark with medical records that made my blood run cold. I've been tracking suspicious deaths for 2 years. Elderly patients showing sudden mental decline, always followed by fatal accidents within weeks. The symptoms suggest deliberate poisoning with mercury or arsenic. Elena served coffee while documenting each testimony, her boarding house ledger becoming a record of systematic genocide. Federal Marshal Crawford arrives tomorrow morning, she announced. Sheriff Morrison arranged a meeting at dawn before the territorial authorities know he's in town. As witnesses shared their stories, baby Miguel slept peacefully in my arms, unaware that his survival had exposed a criminal network spanning 3 territories. Each testimony added weight to our case. Murdered grandmothers, stolen babies, corrupted courts, and a judge who'd turned territorial law into a weapon against the vulnerable. There's something else, Dr. Brennan said quietly. Judge Thornfield has been asking questions about you, Mrs. Harrison. He knows Thomas and Victoria reported you dead, but he's concerned about loose ends. The danger was escalating. If Thornfield suspected I'd survived the desert, he'd move quickly to eliminate witnesses before federal authorities could act. Joseph Whitehorse arrived as midnight approached, bringing news from the Ute Tribal Council. Our scouts report unusual activity at the territorial courthouse. Thornfield's been burning documents for 3 days, destroying evidence of his illegal adoptions and fraudulent probate cases. He knows we're building a case against him, Sheriff Morrison concluded, which means tomorrow's meeting with Marshal Crawford is our only chance to present evidence before Thornfield eliminates it entirely. Elena gathered the testimonies we'd collected, wrapping them in oiled cloth to protect against moisture and damage. These stories represent years of injustice, dozens of murdered innocents. Marshal Crawford will have everything he needs to bring federal charges. I looked around the room at the faces of people who'd risked their lives to seek justice. Mexican families denied legal standing, Ute tribal members ignored by territorial courts, honest lawmen frustrated by corruption. We'd created something powerful here, a community united by shared determination to protect the innocent. Tomorrow we give Marshal Crawford enough evidence to destroy Thornfield's network, I said, holding baby Miguel closer. And we make sure this never happens to another family. As witnesses departed into the night, I realized we'd accomplished something remarkable. We'd built a case strong enough to bring down territorial corruption, but more importantly, we'd proven that justice was possible when communities worked together across cultural boundaries. Dawn would bring our confrontation with federal authority, but tonight belonged to the quiet satisfaction of knowing we'd fought for the voiceless and won. The Sacred Council Circle had been used by Ute leaders for generations to make decisions that would protect their people's future. As dawn approached over the Colorado mountains, Joseph Whitehorse led our diverse group into the traditional space where federal law and ancient wisdom would unite against territorial corruption. Sheriff Morrison sat beside Elena Vasquez, both understanding they were witnessing something historic, the fusion of three legal traditions in pursuit of justice. Federal authority, tribal law, and Mexican family rights converging to protect the innocent from systematic predation. In our tradition, Joseph began lighting sage and passing the smoke to each member of our circle. Justice must restore balance to the community. Judge Thornfield's crimes have created wounds that reach across all our peoples. Federal Marshal Samuel Crawford had arrived before sunrise, a lean man in his 40s, whose weathered face suggested years of frontier law enforcement. He studied our assembled evidence with the careful attention of someone who understood that territorial corruption required federal intervention. "This documentation is extraordinary," Crawford said, reviewing testimonies and financial records. "But federal court requires specific protocols for cross-cultural testimony. We need to ensure Ute and Mexican witnesses can present their evidence in ways that federal judges will accept." Elena spoke with quiet dignity. "Our families have been keeping records in Spanish and Ute languages. We can provide translations, but more importantly, we can provide the truth about what these criminals have done to our children." I held baby Miguel as we planned our legal strategy, thinking about how his survival had become the key to exposing an entire network of murder and theft. "Miguel represents more than just one stolen child," I said. "He's proof that this operation crosses cultural boundaries, targeting anyone they consider vulnerable." Joseph nodded. "The Ute Tribal Council has voted to provide official testimony under federal jurisdiction. We waive our sovereign immunity in this case because justice for our murdered elders and stolen children transcends territorial politics." Crawford made careful notes. "With tribal cooperation and Mexican family testimony, we can establish federal jurisdiction under the Interstate Commerce Clause. This network operated across territorial boundaries, which makes it a federal crime." Dr. Brennan arrived as the sun crested the mountains, carrying additional medical evidence. "I've documented the poisoning methods used against elderly victims. Mercury and arsenic administered in doses that create symptoms resembling dementia. It's systematic murder disguised as natural mental decline." "The child protection aspect is crucial," Elena added. "Miguel needs to be placed with his surviving family members, but we must ensure his safety during the legal proceedings. Thornfield's network will try to eliminate witnesses." Sheriff Morrison had been quietly studying the tactical situation. "We need to arrest Thornfield and his accomplices simultaneously. If any of them escape, they'll warn the others and destroy remaining evidence." Crawford consulted his pocket watch. "Federal warrants are being prepared in Denver. By noon today, we'll have authority to arrest Judge Thornfield, Thomas Harrison, Victoria Harrison, and their known accomplices across 3 territories." I felt a complex mix of emotions at hearing Thomas's name on the arrest warrant. The boy I'd raised was about to face federal justice for attempting to murder his own mother, but my grief was tempered by determination to protect the innocent child in my arms. "There's one more thing," Joseph said, his voice carrying the weight of traditional authority. "In Ute law, crimes against elders and children require community witness. We request that arrests be made publicly so our people can see that justice crosses all boundaries." Crawford nodded respectfully. "Federal law allows for public arrests when community healing requires transparency. Judge Thornfield will face justice in full view of all the communities he's harmed." As we prepared to leave the sacred circle, Elena touched my arm. "Rosa would be proud to know her son survived because communities came together. Miguel will grow up knowing he was saved by the unity of all peoples." Looking down at the sleeping baby, I realized we'd created something more powerful than just a legal case. We'd proven that justice was possible when traditional wisdom guided federal authority, when cultural boundaries dissolved in the face of shared moral purpose. The arrests would come at noon, but the real victory was already won: the creation of a community strong enough to protect its most vulnerable members. The sheriff's office had been transformed into a federal command post, with Marshal Crawford's deputies arriving throughout the morning to coordinate the largest law enforcement operation in Colorado Territory's history. Maps covered every surface marked with locations where simultaneous arrests would take place across 3 territories. Judge Thornfield is currently in his private chambers destroying the last of his illegal adoption records, Deputy Marshal Williams reported. "Our surveillance confirms he's unaware of federal involvement. Thomas and Victoria Harrison are at the territorial courthouse filing final probate documents for the Harrison estate. I sat in the corner holding baby Miguel, watching federal authority prepare to bring justice to the criminals who'd tried to murder us both. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was officially dead according to territorial records, which meant my testimony would come as a devastating surprise to the defendants. Elena Vasquez had spent the morning coordinating witness protection, ensuring that vulnerable community members would be safe during the arrests and subsequent trials. The Mexican families are ready to testify, she reported to Marshal Crawford. Dr. Brennan has medical evidence prepared, and the Ute Tribal Council has appointed Joseph Whitehorse as their official representative. Crawford studied the arrest warrants that had arrived by telegraph from Denver. Federal charges include conspiracy to commit murder, interstate trafficking of stolen children, judicial corruption, and racketeering. These are capital offenses that carry potential death sentences. The scope of evidence we'd assembled was staggering. Financial records showing systematic theft of inheritance funds, medical documentation proving deliberate poisoning of elderly victims, testimony from families whose children had been stolen and sold, and most damning of all, the living proof represented by baby Miguel's survival. "There's one complication," Sheriff Morrison announced as noon approached. "Word has reached some of Thornfield's accomplices that federal marshals are in town. 3 known associates have already fled toward the New Mexico border." Crawford's expression hardened. "Telegraph the Santa Fe office. I want roadblocks established at every territorial crossing. This network ends today completely and permanently." As federal deputies took their positions around Silverdale, I realized we were witnessing the evolution of frontier justice. No longer would territorial corruption go unchallenged by federal authority. No longer would vulnerable communities face systematic predation without legal recourse. Joseph Whitehorse arrived with a dozen Ute warriors, not as combatants, but as witnesses representing their people's demand for justice. "The tribal council requests permission to observe the arrests," he told Crawford. "Our elders need to see that federal law protects all peoples equally." "Granted," Crawford replied. "This operation succeeds because communities work together across cultural boundaries. The arrests should reflect that unity." Elena gathered the Mexican families who'd lost children to Thornfield's network, their faces showing a mixture of grief and hope. "Today we get justice for Rosa, for Carmen, for all the mothers who died protecting their babies," she said. "Today we prove that family means more than blood or legal documents." Dr. Brennan arrived with the final piece of evidence: laboratory analysis of tissue samples from suspicious deaths confirming systematic mercury poisoning across multiple cases.
"This proves premeditated murder, not accidental deaths from natural mental decline," he announced. As the church bells chimed noon, Marshal Crawford stood before our assembled group: federal deputies, local law enforcement, Ute tribal representatives, Mexican families, and one supposedly dead mining widow holding a stolen baby who'd become the key to exposing an entire criminal network. "Today, we demonstrate that justice transcends territorial boundaries, cultural differences, and corrupt local authority," Crawford declared. "Today we prove that federal law exists to protect the innocent from systematic predation." I looked down at baby Miguel, thinking about his mother Rosa, who died to give him life, about the elderly victims who'd trusted family members who betrayed them.
I stood up, feeling the weight of all the victims we were representing, all the families who deserved justice, all the communities that had been systematically targeted by territorial corruption. "Marshal Crawford," I said, "I've been ready since the moment they tried to murder me in the desert. Let's go arrest some criminals." As we prepared to leave for the territorial courthouse, I realized that my resurrection from the desert had become something larger than personal survival. It had become a symbol of justice that couldn't be killed, truth that couldn't be buried, and community strength that couldn't be broken by individual greed. The town square of Silverdale had never seen anything like the gathering that assembled as federal marshals prepared to arrest Judge Thornfield's criminal network. Ute warriors stood beside Mexican families, Anglo settlers next to tribal elders, all united by shared determination to witness justice for the systematic crimes that had torn their communities apart. Joseph Whitehorse carried the eagle staff that represented Ute tribal authority, its feathers catching the midday sun as our procession moved toward the territorial courthouse. Today, all peoples speak with one voice, he announced to the growing crowd. Today, we prove that justice belongs to the community, not to corrupt officials. Elena Vasquez walked beside me holding a photograph of her daughter Rosa, the young mother who died giving birth to the baby now sleeping peacefully in my arms. Miguel will grow up knowing his mother was avenged by people who never knew her but fought for her anyway, she said, tears of pride mixing with grief on her weathered face. The crowd that followed us represented something unprecedented in Colorado territory, a coalition that crossed every cultural boundary, united by shared experience of victimization and shared commitment to protecting the innocent. Dr. Brennan carried his medical evidence, Sheriff Morrison wore his badge with renewed pride, and federal marshals flanked our procession with the authority of Washington behind them. Look at them, I whispered to baby Miguel, gesturing toward the diverse faces surrounding us. This is what real family looks like, people who choose to stand together when evil threatens the vulnerable. Marshal Crawford had positioned his deputies strategically around the courthouse, but the real power of our operation came from the moral authority represented by our community alliance. Judge Thornfield might control territorial law, but he faced something far stronger, the united voice of every community he'd harmed. As we approached the courthouse steps, I could see Thomas and Victoria through the windows, still believing they'd successfully murdered me and stolen my fortune. Their shock at seeing me alive would be nothing compared to their horror at facing federal charges for systematic murder and child trafficking. Are you ready for this confrontation? Elena asked, noting my steady breathing despite the magnitude of what we were about to accomplish. I looked around at the faces of people who'd risked everything to seek justice. Ute families who'd lost elders to suspicious poisoning Mexican mothers whose daughters had disappeared into Thornfield's network. Anglo settlers who'd watched their neighbors die under mysterious circumstances. We'd created something powerful here, a community strong enough to challenge territorial corruption. I've been ready since they left me to die in the desert, I replied, feeling the weight of cultural authority and federal law converging in this moment. Today, we prove that some things are more important than individual greed, protecting children, honoring elders, and ensuring that justice serves the community rather than predators. Joseph raised the eagle staff as courthouse doors opened and federal marshals moved into position. Let all peoples witness, he called out in both Ute and English. Let justice be done in the sight of the community. The crowd fell silent as Marshal Crawford's voice echoed across the square. By authority of the United States Federal Court, I have warrants for the arrest of Judge Marcus Thornfield, Thomas Harrison, and Victoria Harrison on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, interstate child trafficking, and judicial corruption. As the courthouse doors opened and the criminals who'd tried to destroy our families faced the justice they'd tried to escape, I realized we'd accomplished something historic, the creation of a community strong enough to protect its most vulnerable members across all cultural boundaries. The courthouse doors opened like the gates of judgment as federal marshals entered with warrants that would destroy the criminal network that had terrorized 3 territories. Judge Marcus Thornfield emerged first, his face pale with shock at seeing the crowd of witnesses gathered to watch his downfall. What is the meaning of this disruption? Thornfield demanded, his voice carrying the arrogance of a man who'd grown accustomed to controlling territorial law. I am conducting official court business. Marshal Crawford stepped forward, his federal badge gleaming in the Colorado sunlight. Judge Marcus Thornfield, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, judicial corruption, and interstate trafficking of stolen children. The crowd fell silent as Thomas and Victoria appeared in the courthouse doorway, their faces showing confusion that quickly transformed into horror when they saw me standing in the town square, very much alive, holding the baby they'd left to die in the desert. That's impossible, Victoria whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. She's dead. We left her in the canyon with no water, no horse, no way to survive. Confession number 1, Marshal Crawford announced to the crowd. Attempted murder by abandonment in the desert? Thomas stared at me with the expression of a man seeing his worst nightmare come to life. Mom, we thought... The desert heat, the distance from help. You thought you'd murdered me for my mining fortune? I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of this moment. Just like you murdered Rosa Vasquez Herrera for her baby, just like Judge Thornfield murdered at least 12 elderly victims across 3 territories. Elena stepped forward, holding Rosa's photograph high for all to see. This is my daughter Rosa. She died giving birth to the baby these criminals stole. Her son Miguel survived because communities came together to seek justice. Dr. Brennan presented his medical evidence to Marshal Crawford. Systematic mercury poisoning designed to simulate dementia, followed by convenient accidents that eliminated elderly victims after their assets were transferred through fraudulent legal documents. Judge Thornfield's composure cracked completely. These are wild accusations from disgruntled territorial residents. I have legal immunity as a sitting judge. Territorial immunity doesn't protect against federal charges, Crawford replied, especially when those charges include interstate crimes and violations of federal civil rights. Joseph Whitehorse stepped forward, the Eagle staff representing the authority of the Ute Tribal Council. This man's crimes crossed all boundaries. Anglo-Mexican and Ute families suffered equally. Federal law must speak for all peoples when territorial law fails. The cultural testimony that followed was devastating. Family after family stepped forward to describe missing daughters, murdered grandparents, stolen children. The systematic nature of Thornfield's network became undeniable as witness after witness confirmed the same pattern of targeting vulnerable community members. Miguel bears the traditional markings of the Herrera family, Elena announced, showing the baby's wrist to the crowd. He is living proof of this criminal network's trafficking operation. Victoria made one last desperate attempt to maintain her lies. The child was legally adopted through proper territorial channels. We have documentation. Forged documentation, Marshal Crawford corrected, displaying the falsified papers. Created through Judge Thornfield's corrupt court system to legitimize child trafficking and inheritance theft. As federal marshals placed shackles on Thomas Victoria and Judge Thornfield, I felt a complex mixture of justice and grief. The boy I'd raised was finally facing consequences for choosing greed over family, but the community that had supported this investigation had proven that real family transcends blood relations. The federal court will ensure these criminals face appropriate punishment, Crawford announced to the assembled crowd. But the real victory belongs to the communities that refuse to accept systematic victimization as inevitable. Looking around at the faces of people who'd risked everything to seek justice, Ute tribal members, Mexican families, Anglo settlers, honest law enforcement, I realized we'd accomplished something historic. We'd proven that when communities unite across cultural boundaries, even the most entrenched corruption can be defeated. As the prisoners were loaded into federal transport wagons, baby Miguel stirred in my arms, opening his dark eyes to look up at me with trust and innocence. He would grow up knowing his mother had been avenged by people who'd never met her but fought for her anyway. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a new kind of community had been born. The sacred ceremony took place 3 days after the arrests in the meadow between Silverdale and the Ute Reservation, where 3 cultures could gather as equals. Elena Vasquez had spent those days preparing traditional Mexican blessing rituals for her grandson, while Joseph Whitehorse consulted with tribal elders about the proper protocols for honoring a child who belonged to multiple communities. I sat in the circle of witnesses holding baby Miguel, now dressed in a tiny outfit that Elena had sewn by hand, decorated with both Mexican embroidery and Ute beadwork that represented his mixed heritage. Federal Marshal Crawford had remained in Silverdale to oversee the legal aspects of Miguel's placement, ensuring that cultural traditions would be respected within federal law. "Today we give this child his true name," Elena announced, her voice carrying clearly across the meadow. Miguel Rosa Herrera Vasquez, named for his grandfather and his mother, carrying the honor of both families who claim him as their own. Joseph Whitehorse stepped forward with sage smoke blessing the infant according to Ute traditions that honored children as gifts to the entire community. "This child has survived great evil to bring justice to all our peoples. He will grow up knowing he belongs to every family that fought to save him." Dr. Brennan had brought official documentation from the federal court papers that would ensure Miguel's legal protection and guarantee his inheritance from both his Mexican family and, surprisingly, from me. I'd decided that a portion of my mining fortune should provide for his education and future, a legacy that honored his mother's sacrifice. The federal court recognizes Elena Vasquez as Miguel's legal guardian, Marshal Crawford announced, with Mary Whitehorse Harrison designated as his adoptive grandmother and cultural mentor. This arrangement ensures he'll grow up knowing all aspects of his heritage. Elena accepted the baby from my arms with tears of joy and grief intermingled. "Rosa Mia, your son will know how brave you were, how many people loved you enough to seek justice for your death. He will grow up proud of his Mexican heritage and respectful of the Ute and Anglo communities that saved his life. The ceremony continued with blessings from all three cultural traditions represented in our alliance. Ute elders spoke words of protection, Mexican families offered prayers for Miguel's future, and Anglo settlers pledged their support for his upbringing. It was unprecedented in Colorado territory, a child being formally adopted by an entire multicultural community. "This is what real family looks like," I said, watching Miguel sleep peacefully in Elena's arms while surrounded by people from every background who'd committed to protecting him. Not blood relations who betray you for money, but communities that choose to love and protect the innocent. Joseph smiled, his weathered face showing satisfaction at seeing traditional values triumph over territorial corruption. "The spirits guided us well, sister. This child will grow up knowing that justice crosses all boundaries when communities work together." As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, our diverse gathering shared a meal that represented the fusion of cultures that had made Miguel's survival possible. Mexican recipes prepared by Elena, traditional Ute foods provided by Joseph's family, and Anglo contributions from Silverdale's grateful residents. "Miguel will never lack for family," Elena said, holding her grandson while he slept. "He has Mexican grandparents, a Ute tribal family, an Anglo adoptive grandmother, and an entire community committed to his welfare." Looking around at the faces of people who'd risked everything to save one innocent child, I realized we'd created something more valuable than any mining fortune. A new definition of family based on love, protection, and shared moral purpose rather than blood relations or legal documents. Miguel Rosa Herrera Vasquez would grow up knowing he was saved by the power of community unity, and that knowledge would make him stronger than any inheritance could. 6 months later, I sit on the porch of my rebuilt home in Silverdale, watching Miguel take his first steps in Elena's garden while Joseph's grandchildren teach him Ute words for the flowers he's trying to pick. The federal trials concluded with life sentences for Judge Thornfield and 20-year terms for Thomas and Victoria, but the real victory was the community we built in seeking justice. Elena has become more than Miguel's guardian. She's become my closest friend, a woman whose strength and wisdom rival any mining baron I ever knew. We spend evenings planning Miguel's education, ensuring he'll learn Spanish, Ute, and English, that he'll understand his mother's courage and the community that saved his life. "He's walking toward you, abuela," Elena calls out, using the Spanish word for grandmother that Miguel has started applying to both of us. The child toddles across the garden with the determination of someone who's survived impossible odds, his dark eyes bright with curiosity about the world that fought to protect him. Joseph visits weekly, bringing news from the reservation and stories that will help Miguel understand his place in the larger community that spans 3 cultures. The tribal council voted to make him an honorary member, Joseph announced last week. He'll always have a place with the Ute people, just as he has a place with his Mexican family and his Anglo community. Dr. Brennan stops by regularly, not as a physician, but as a friend who helped expose the criminal network that terrorized our territories. Sheriff Morrison has been promoted to territorial marshal, his honest service finally recognized by authorities who understand the value of law enforcement that serves communities rather than corrupt officials. The mining fortune that Thomas tried to steal has been restructured into a trust that supports education for children from all cultural backgrounds, ensures medical care for elderly community members, and provides legal assistance for families facing exploitation. Money that was meant to be stolen by murderers now serves the communities they tried to destroy. As sunset paints the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and red, Miguel settles into my lap while Elena hums a lullaby that blends Mexican melodies with Ute rhythms. This is what family really means, not blood relations who betray you for profit, but communities that choose to love and protect the innocent. "Tell me about my mama," Miguel says in his mixture of languages, and Elena begins the story of Rosa's courage, of the community that sought justice for her death, of the love that saved her son. Looking around at the faces of people who've become my true family, I realize that surviving the desert taught me something more valuable than any mining claim. That the strongest foundations aren't built on gold or silver, but on the bonds between people who choose to stand together when evil threatens the innocent. This is our new equilibrium, built on justice, sustained by love, and strengthened by the knowledge that real family transcends every boundary except the ones we choose to honor. Spring came early that year, softening the scars the winter wind had left across the Colorado plains. The snowmelt ran silver through the gullies behind my ranch, whispering the same song my grandfather said the land always sings after justice has been done. 6 months had passed since the arrests, and though the newspapers still printed stories about the territorial scandal of the century, Silverdale itself had settled into quiet renewal. The federal trials concluded in Denver under heavy guard. Judge Thornfield was sentenced to life at Fort Leavenworth. His courtroom, once a theater of greed, now stood empty with its windows boarded. Thomas and Victoria faced the same fate, their names erased from the mining ledgers they had tried to forge. When the verdict was read, I felt no triumph, only a heavy stillness, as though something long festering had at last drained from the earth. I returned home with baby Miguel in my arms and Elena Vasquez at my side. We rebuilt what had been broken plank by plank. The sheriff's deputies helped me reclaim the Harrison property not for wealth but for purpose. The old mining office became a schoolhouse where children from Ute Mexican and settler families now learned side by side. Some mornings I sit by the window and listen to them recite lessons, their voices weaving 3 languages into one harmony. It is the sound of a future my ancestors could scarcely imagine. Chief Joseph Whitehorse visits, often bringing his grandsons to help with the spring planting. He tells them stories of the canyon where the spirits kept me alive and insists Miguel grows stronger because that sacred wind still watches over him. Elena laughs when he says this, yet every night she lights a candle for Rosa, the daughter who died but whose courage restored us all. Between her prayers and Joseph's songs, the boy will never forget where he came from. Some evenings I walk to the ridge overlooking Silverdale and watch the town's lamps flicker on one by one. The courthouse bell no longer signals corruption but community meetings. Sheriff Morrison, now territorial marshal, keeps his office door open to everyone, and Dr. Brennan has turned part of the jailhouse into a clinic for the elderly. The money once meant for my betrayal now funds these things through the Harmony Trust, a foundation established in memory of those lost. Last night, Miguel pointed at the horizon where the sun sank behind the Sangre de Cristo range and asked, "Abuela, is that where the desert begins?" I nodded. "Yes, mijo, and it's also where courage begins." He didn't understand yet, but someday he will. The world remembers the trial as a legal victory, but out here we know it was something deeper, a spiritual rebalancing. We buried the greed that poisoned our families and planted justice in its place. Now, as spring breathes new life into the high country, I see what my grandfather meant: the land heals when its people do. And as the wind moves through the junipers and the first wildflowers open along the canyon trail, I whisper a promise to the generations yet to come that truth once spoken never dies in silence.